Minutes after 8. We spent a bit of time on the program over the course of the year talking about the plight of the ambulance driver. Perhaps it's miscategorised because it's not the plight of the AMBO in reality, it's the plight of the person that's called for the AMBO. And the Ambulance Union has suggested that a shortage of crews contributed to 2 deaths on Friday night. One in Walkerville, where a 000 call was received at 6 o'clock for an elderly patient suffering shortness of breath. They were triaged as lights and sirens, an emergency case, but 28 minutes later, no ambulance had been sent. At that point, the patient fell unconscious. The patient's partner had to start CPR. Paramedics did not arrive until 38 minutes after the 000 call was made, when typically they would arrive within 16 minutes. And by the time they got there, the person had died. In Newton, there was a 000 call that was received at 7:19 p.m. for an elderly patient who was disoriented. That was considered an urgent case. An ambulance was supposed to arrive within 30 minutes, but 40 minutes later there hadn't been one, and there had been none even sent out there because there was simply none available. The case was upgraded to a lights and sirens response. There was still no ambulance available. Then there were 10 other lights and siren cases at this time that were all uncovered. 10 other cases that no one could get to. At 8:13, so we're talking almost an hour later, an ambulance was sent from North Adelaide. It arrived 1 hour and 5 minutes after the 000 call was made, and the patient was at that stage in cardiac arrest. It's understood by the union that that person passed away. Jess is a paramedic who was working that night on the weekend. Jess, good morning to you, and thanks for joining us on 5AA Breakfast.
Good morning.
Now, Jess, as Will said, we heard a couple of weeks ago from so many of your colleagues, and we can't even begin to imagine the stress that all this puts you guys under.
Yeah, so I've been a paramedic for 7 years, and my partner on that afternoon shift has been a paramedic for 30 years, so very well experienced crew, and we've never been affected by a job like we were on Friday night. So usually, even if it's a traumatic job, you get there and you can render some assistance and potentially improve that patient's outcome. But on Friday, unfortunately, we weren't able to offer them that, and that was heartbreaking. It was an impossible situation for the call takers, for the dispatchers, for us. And it was like that all afternoon. It wasn't just a surge around knock-off time for the day crews. It was like that all day. We started at midday and we finished at midnight, and it was unrelenting.
It sounds from what I've heard about this case, Jess, like you almost just you and your colleague ended up playing a comforting role to this poor man who wasn't angry.
Yeah.
He was quite sort of resigned, sadly, to what had happened, and was showing you photographs of his wife and talking about their 57 years of marriage. It just sounds like the most heartbreaking scene.
Oh, it was horrendous. So obviously they were waiting around 40 minutes for us to arrive, and over that time he was watching his wife suffer with what sounded like respiratory distress. We can obviously offer a lot of assistance for various causes of shortness of breath, and if time were afforded to her, there likely would have been a different outcome. But unfortunately she did pass away, and when we arrived and told him that she had passed away, his words were, "I guess you were too busy after all." Now, what do you say to that?
Oh,
how do you respond to someone who is broken and who's just lost their wife, knowing that you have played a part in not being able to help her?
Well, the system has. You haven't. The system has.
Yeah, and he wasn't angry at us. He wasn't angry at the dispatchers or the call takers. In fact, he was just grateful that he wasn't alone on the phone when all of this was happening. And then he sat down on the couch and started showing us pictures of his wife and told us the story of how they met over coffee at Sydney University. And it was so obvious that they were still so in love, even after 57 years. And knowing that if we had have been there half an hour earlier, chances are they probably would have been going on to 58 years, 59 years, it's impossible. And the people that are making the decisions are not the people that are having to come and stand in front of the families and see this. They don't see the effects that it's having on people.
Yeah.
And that's what's so hard.
Hey, thanks for sharing that story, Jess. It's clearly still pretty raw. And, as we said, I can't even imagine what it's like to be put into that situation. Good on you for talking to us on 5AA Breakfast. We've also got Leah Watkins from the Ambulance Employees Association. Leah, thanks for your time. We understand that the ambulance boss, David Place, or the ambulance service itself, has referred both of these deaths to the coroner. It does sound like something that purely comes down to a resourcing question in our eyes.
Good morning, and thanks for having me on. Yes, and it's certainly something that we've been saying for years now, and I know our Secretary, Phil Palmer, has said, many times that this is the worst it's been, and then, again, nothing is done, there's no extra resources put on, and so, a few months later he's out there again saying this is now the worst it's been, and Friday night was certainly the worst we've ever heard it, but with the state government saying that then they know that more resources are needed, they have the money, but they're just not going to put them on until they get something out of the AMBOs. And even when they do, it's going to take a while to onboard those new staff. We're very concerned that it's going to get even worse before it gets better. We need these resources now. It is unconscionable to me that any government could sit there and play with the community's lives and their safety in this way, that they would use this as a bargaining chip. I mean, if the shoe was on the other foot and our members were going on strike until they got the conditions that they wanted, we would certainly be portrayed as being wholly irresponsible, and we would be. We would never do something like that. That's why when our members take industrial action, they don't go on strike. They do little things like, talking on ambulances, because they in no way could ever put their patients in jeopardy.
Yeah.
And it's just awful. Yeah.
It is, and you'd have to have a heart of stone not to be moved by what Jess just had to say. Imagine losing good people like Jess to the industry too, because that's a work night.
Yeah.
Everything about that is awful. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Leah. We appreciate it. Mick's called in on this issue. Morning, Mick.
Instead of putting the $750 million into this new stadium, I think the extra resources should go into public health, and that is extra ambulances and extra bedding. Simple as that. The most important thing you have is to get an AMBO there to at least do a triage and determine the nature of the injury or the illness, and at least they can do what they can to stabilise. And the other problem here is that once they've done that and they've taken the patient to the hospital, they're ramping. So I've put a direct challenge to Stephen Marshall right now to think twice about the $750 million instead of going to another stadium, because we have the Adelaide Oval. Instead, we need to put the money where it's needed most, and that is for the integrity of life.
Good on you, Mick. Thank you.
Thanks, Mick.
We have received a deluge of texts on the Telstra Storm Mount Barker text line responding to the paramedic Jess, who took us through what it was like turning up to find someone who she believes could have been saved on a night where there were delays in sending out ambulances due to staffing shortages, and having to deal with the husband of someone who'd been married for decades, show them pictures and remark, well, I guess you were busy doing something else.
I'll tell you what, too, we cannot find a single message supporting the government or the ambulance service over this. One here says, sadly, the solution will be a stern letter to Jess to stop talking about it. A lot talking about the arena as well. Phil says, forget the new arena, just fix our health system. One here says, these people saying no stadium, there has to be a balance, will become known as the state to come to if you need an ambulance or a hospital bed. There'll be nothing else to do. Look at the bigger picture. One here, Christina says, at kids' sport on the weekend, I was talking to a group of parents who I would consider not overly politically engaged, and all brought up concerns about the ambulance and hospital systems, and not one mentioned how great a new entertainment centre would be. One here from Ken just says, Dave and Will, hi, I'm not voting for this government anymore. That last story opened my eyes. Jane with a Y says, totally agree. We do not need this new centre. Use the money for AMBO's mental health and low-cost housing. That's where I want my tax money to go, not another building for the minority. Scott from Modbury, I'm sure Scott won't mind us characterising him as someone who's a pretty conservative voter.
Absolutely.
In fact, from memory, Scott, a lot of your tweets, messages and texts over the last few years were sticking up for Donald Trump. Scott says, "Morning, boys. If the Premier, after hearing the paramedic tell her story, doesn't come on the show before 9 and say, I'm bidding the new stadium and going to funnel the money into fixing our ambulance service, he's lost my vote." Tyson says, "Absolutely heartbreaking listening to Ambo Jess. How hard is it for our government to get things right? Don't spend 700 mil on a stadium until you've fixed up the ambulance system." And on they go.
The person who described it as heartbreaking was right. Listen to Jess describe it. Someone who's gone into being an AMBO ostensibly to help people.
Yeah.
Having just to turn up to, confirm the bad news, basically, because you couldn't get there in a time that they consider acceptable.
Well, that was more like palliative care and grief counselling.
It was.
Than getting you from A to B, getting you from the house to a hospital.
When we spoke with Ambos the other week, one of them was a young guy who said, "I've just quit. I can't do that. I can't deal with this anymore." And this is not core business. This is having to explain, well, emergency call-outs were meant to get there in 16 minutes. We're getting there in 30 plus. And the person died in these interceding 14 minutes. That's this that people are saying, I don't want to be part of that anymore.
I had a good chat down at the wineries on Saturday with one of our friends who's an AMBO, and I don't think she's got a political bone in her body. And she just said to me, I heard when you had the Treasurer on talking about all these new jobs that have been filled, none of us know where they are. Well, she's just scratching her head, saying, I heard him talking about all the extra money that's being poured in, but in terms of what it actually looks like on the ground, and as I said, she's not, I don't know, she might even be a Liberal voter for all I know. She's not a union rabble-rouser. Just mystified by it.
Jack on Twitter says, listening to Jess's story is absolutely distressing and only the tip of the iceberg. How dare anyone suggest this is only about wages? Thank you for that. You can keep your feedback coming in on the Telstra Storm Out Barker text line, or you can call in 8223 0000, or indeed tweet us or jump on the $5 Facebook or YouTube live streams. It's coming up to 17 minutes to 9.